Well, Tester, we're here. We're live. Welcome back,
okay.
everybody. I'm Sean Flock. I'm here with Scotty Hagnes. This is the Fitness, Wellness, and Longevity Podcast. Scotty, how goes it, man?
Hey, going pretty good, other than trying to stay warm here.
Nah, it's not that bad, actually. When you go outside, there's about 40-mile-an-hour winds that will knock you off your bike if you are not careful, right, Scott?
It's
Scott,
definitely possible, yeah.
So the one of the things here in Portland is that it is actually very dry, but sometimes when it's dry, we get some kind of special wind coming down from, like, the heavens. Is that right, Scott?
Yeah, we have the Columbia Gorge here where the Columbia River slices between Oregon and Washington, and it basically channels cold air from the east into this area, so we have colder weather here than you would have pretty much anywhere across the other western Oregon and Washington. So even though we're well south of Seattle, it's typically a lot colder in the winter here. So, yeah, that's going on right now. It's delightful. My least favorite weather.
It cuts right through you. Well, I looked at the weather in Delray Beach. It's 84 degrees and a low of 76 today, and it's the middle of November as of this podcast, so I don't know what to make of that. Hopefully it starts getting cooler. I don't know. I'll take this cold weather, though. I'm not adverse to cold weather. I don't like the wet. If it's snowy and wet and I'm getting that's one thing. But cool weather, you walk around, you feel warm. We got the sun shining here. It doesn't get much better than that. Now, myself and Scott here, the reason why I was up here is we went to a Human Matrix seminar just down the road from where Scott's gym is, literally walking distance. Hey, Scott?
Yeah, it's 5 blocks maybe.
Yeah. So it was at Evolution Healthcare and Health and Fitness, I believe, was it? Mm-hmm. So really cool facility. They specialize probably more in personal training, and they have physical therapy there as well. They had a pretty cool altitude training room type of thing. Did you get a chance to look at that at all, Scott?
I didn't go in there, but I looked in. It's interesting. They have a lot of modalities, including the endless rock wall in there.
Yeah, that's a pretty gangster thing. I think just being in this area, probably there's a little bit more conducive to climbing than it is South Florida, eh, Scott?
Yeah, there's a lot of climbing here. Well, as you noticed, 2 blocks from there's a big rock gym as well.
Yep.
Just one of many, actually, but that's one of the more renowned ones in the area.
Nice. All right, so the Human Matrix seminar was by Zac Cupples, hosted by Zac Cupples, and he had about 18 people there, Scott. The Scott and I have kind of Scott, actually, you introduced me to postural restoration about 4 or 5 years ago, right?
Mm-hmm. I think so.
Yeah. You had taken like a myokin course or something like that?
Myokinematics course, yeah, in 2014 maybe.
That sounds about right. About 4 or 5 years ago. So yeah, along the way, Scott's continued to kind of expand his knowledge of not only breathing, but also different FRC principles and kin stretch principles and all that kind of stuff as well. But this weekend was dedicated toward the interpretation of the postural restoration concepts in the mindset of what Zac Cupples does. So for those of you who do not know who Zac Cupples is, he's a physical therapist from, I believe he's originally from, he was working in Memphis, I know, but now he lives in California, right, Scott?
Yeah, kind of Northern California.
Yeah.
Outside the Sacramento area, I believe.
Yeah, I think so. So I want to say he's taken all the courses like at least once from the Postural Restoration Institute and has integrated into his clinic. He's a physical therapist, but he was also a strength and conditioning coach for the Memphis Grizzlies, which is an NBA team, and now he works for the D-League on a team there where he's actually heading up the strength and conditioning program there. So, Scott, you had said, hey, come on up. He's doing a seminar here. How did you hear about the seminar, and how did you hear about Zac?
I don't remember where I initially heard. There's a big network of coaches that I tend to follow, and I'm somewhere in there. So I've been following him for a couple of years. Has a lot of good content online. If any of you are interested, definitely check that out. And then I just happened to see he was doing one of his Human Matrix seminars here in town, and then I looked and said, geez, it's only a couple blocks away. So then we had chatted about it, and I know you've been into those concepts for a while, so it made even though it's far away for you, free place to stay and vehicle and all that makes it a little easier. So a good excuse to get you out here too.
Yeah, we're trying to get out here for quite some time now, but I wish I had actually more time to be out here just to hang out, see the sites a little bit, and not have all strictly business. But I'm appreciative of you, giving me a place to stay. And it works. The universe works very funny like that. How close this is to where you are, and So the synopsis of the entire seminar was the concept of how our rib cage mechanics, specifically our infrasternal angle, relates to the mechanics of our pelvis, and the scap, basically. So going into this, I think we both had an appreciation that breathing is important, but from this frame of mindset and frame of reference, definitely different than what you've seen before, Scott. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely a little different focus and a kind of simplified, breaking it down into what's really useful and how to progress it.
Yes,
which was pretty phenomenal, and the devil is in the details on this stuff for sure, and that was one thing that we really spent a lot of time going over. And even though I think we've both done these things, it's not like we've never touched on these principles. Like, I think we'd missed some important points that were.
Yeah, because you had done the Mike Robertson seminar, and he kind of goes over some infrasternal angle stuff too. Was there a difference in the way they went about it or how they assess it?
As far as assessing, no, not really. They are kind of from the same school of thought, because remember Bill Hartman is kind of Zach's big influence, who of course is Mike Robertson's partner there.
And this is through IFAST, I believe?
IFAST,
okay,
yeah.
Cool.
Yep, so it kind of really stems out of, I think, his interpretation of the PRI principles. And so it was quite similar. The difference there at that seminar was that it was a small piece of many things. We had many presenters.
That's right.
And he only had maybe 2 hours to kind of cover the concepts, and here's the assessment of the infrasternal angle, and then what would you do is like basically 1 to 2 drills for each thing. But
yep.
So it was very it was what you could expect to give in 2 hours.
So basically take that and make it a full weekend seminar, would you say? Yeah. And that's kind of what it was, in my opinion. Going into it, I had a basic appreciation for the infrasternal angle stuff, and I've been, to a fault, sometimes get crazy about breathing exercises and the complexities and the intricacies of breathing, but that's just kind of my personality type. When I get into something, I'm all in, and it becomes very much a focus for me. But I agree with you in saying that it's a simplification of a very so much complexity, and I think that's based on the experience of the individual presenting the information. So if I were going to be doing a seminar, it would be based off of my own biases, working with clients that are more athletic populations. However, we saw that Zach is basing it off of his clientele, which are usually a deconditioned population or advanced athletes, right?
Kind of both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas I think you and I kind of are more in that middle ground there, where it's like, yeah, they have basic capacity to move, they have sensory awareness, but they need refinement, right?
Yeah.
So the start off of the weekend with some conceptual things, basic ideas, and then we got right into the nitty-gritty of determining infrasternal angles and how that affects so that's the assessment portion of it in terms of the infrasternal angle, and then how that will affect your exercise selection. I think that was a really cool way of going about this, because it goes right into something that's going to be a practical application for these things, eh?
Right. Yep. How do you go from there to do some drills to prepare you to do work in the right positions, basically?
Yeah, exactly. So from the infrasternal angle,
and for those of you who may not know, so we find the sternum.
Yep.
Here's the angle. So basically just an extremely simplified version. Boom. So mine is about 90 degrees, which is roughly what you want to see, but I have seen people where it's that. I've seen people where it's that. That's
me. But, it's interesting because I know from my own experience, I thought I was a wide. So you really, the devil's in the detail, so to speak, and you really got to get up in that notch right below your sternum, the xiphoid process, and really determining what that angle is. And it was pretty interesting to kind of hear who you're kind of going to be working with when it comes to wide to narrow. I think probably more athletic populations are going to be a bit more narrow. Aside from very deconditioned athletes or never really worked out, or like the powerlifting side of it where they have this big wide sternal angle, and just wide in general, I think you could probably determine just like by looking at somebody what they're probably naturally going to have. Longer, slender people are going to have more narrow, whereas like a boxier person's probably going to have a little bit more of a wide infrasternal angle, and from there you're already going into practical application of this. And when we look at infrasternal angles, that basically is going to shape the way the pelvis is going to be positioned as well, right, Scott?
Right. Yep. Somebody narrow here is going to present with a narrow infrapubic angle.
Yep.
Which is angle at the bottom of the pelvis, essentially, just to simplify it. Wide is going to present wide. They really should be kind of mirror images. So
yep.
As you're wider here, it should get narrow. So as we would inhale, it should narrow and vice versa.
And that's a huge concept that we kind of went over and actually was clarified this weekend. And in most individuals, there's some kind of compensatory, Scott just said it should be a mirror image, but we're finding that there's a compensatory effect where it actually is the same, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's where we get to a little bit of, I don't want to say dysfunction, or Zach wouldn't say dysfunction, but we're going to be running into issues with finding positional stability. And again, stability being one of those ambiguous words, but like being able to pressurize this system here is almost impossible when those two things aren't in mirror image, right, Scott?
Correct. Yeah. And then at that point, that's when you're going to have compensation problems from hips and probably on downstream as well. Yeah.
One of the concepts that I really liked how they went over was, or Zach went over, is how that when that outlet opens up, that's how your organs are being held. It becomes like basically a punch bowl, right? So if you're unable to get your rib cage moving in the proper position, your punch bowl isn't going to be moving in your proper position. And the conversation was pretty funny about how people have basically their guts coming out the front because they've run out of space because their pelvis is in the wrong position. So if you're in that classic anterior tilt, the punch bowl is now.
Let's see if I can
conceptualize
right? here
without having to have me do it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, essentially, the person's pelvis is going to tip. Oops, because I'm backwards here.
Yeah, exactly.
Forwards, and it makes then the guts spill out. So then you end up with this little bit of a pooch belly. You may be shredded, but you're still going to present with a belly because the guts have to have somewhere to go.
Yep.
Because the pelvis isn't catching them properly because it's tilted incorrectly based on where this is sitting.
Yes, exactly. And it starts to open your eyes about when we put just the look of athletes into context. So when you look at enormous power lifters, that power belly, there's a reason for that. They're creating enormous amounts of pressure, which actually spills the guts out the front. Right? And then you look at certain other types of athletes and you see kind of counter to that, depending upon what the specific tasks are. Like if you look at a rower, I don't think I've ever seen a rower with a pooch belly, right?
I can't think of one, no.
Right? And I think that's kind of like lines up with the sport. Like they're in a hugely compressed position, which basically makes it almost impossible for their guts to spill forward. And they're probably driving a lot of that thoracic kyphosis, which kind of that expansion through the back, and that's kind of where they're getting their breath. So it's a lot less dysfunctional, again, an ambiguous word, but a lot less pathological in a lot of ways as well, right?
Not as compensated as
as
a habitual presentation, I guess.
Yes, exactly. So given that, Scott, I think we're in a good agreement here. In terms of reflecting off of the infrasternal angle and then the pelvic position, is this something that you've, or relearning this, is this something that you find is, now that it's refined in terms of the definitions of it and what it looks like, something that you kind of thought you knew and now you're like, oh man, like it's time to go back to the drawing board a little bit?
Yeah, that's pretty much how it would, yep. It's going to be rethinking and refining for sure. And then really kind of understanding how to progress that forward so the training reinforces. So this is not a matter of, okay, we're going to do these drills at the beginning of warm-up and then you're done. You just go train like normal. It's you're taking the principles that you're learning with your resets at the beginning, and then you're bringing them into exercises. And basically, we got our ass kicked with a 15-pound dumbbell yesterday afterwards.
Yeah, without getting too much spoiler alert yet, toward the end of it, you're going into practical application and exercise selection and progressions, which I mean, I drool over that stuff, because as a coach who programs for a lot of the stuff and programs for my gym and programs for individual athletes, there's nothing more satisfying than finding a solid progression for athletes. Not only does it make it a little easier to progress over time and select exercises over time, but you can actually see it in motion, and you can see the improvements all around when they start to master these certain positional exercises, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have a feeling it's going to be really, you'll see PRs and things that you haven't done for a while, or the ability to access certain skills or movements maybe you haven't before without even directly working on them, once you kind of clean up some of the underlying positions.
Yep, and without skipping too far ahead from the infrasternal angles and how that's related to the IPA, and then how to then reposition or reset those positions. It's about basically breathing, and as Zac Cupples says, it's about finding Jesus. Your rib cage coming down at the proper position, and then the pelvis being pulled in the proper position by using glute max. And for the depending on the infrasternal angle, whether it's a narrow or wide, you have certain exercise selections that you might have a little bit more conducive to repositioning or resetting that ISA, the infrasternal angle. So Scott, like for you, what was the biggest aha moment, or what was the biggest misconception you had as you started going through that basic 90-90 exercise? I kind of have something in mind, but I'll see if you point it out as well.
Well, yeah, I know that what I was found unable to do was actually engage glute max properly. I had been doing the position, but definitely not correctly with the right kind of scoop and tuck, and then I found that it was actually kind of a constant theme through as we progressed.
And does that make sense in terms of like what are like some of the limitations in terms of your exercises are in the gym as well? Like, wow, I'm really not able to get to a extended hip position most of the time.
Right. Yeah, that was I failed the hip extension test, though I would. I feel like I have good hip extension, but I clearly don't. So lots of people can get into that position, but it's using some sort of compensation. So, external rotation of the femurs, if you're a single leg stance, so it can be some lateral shifting, ways to work around it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I do not have true hip extension, which means, that makes, leaving some jump height on the table, and obviously any sort of explosive lifts, I'm not able to reach full hip extension.
Yeah.
I'm using compensated structures to attempt to achieve lockout if I'm deadlifting, for example.
Absolutely. And when you start to understand that most people don't have true hip extension, you don't feel as bad, because you're like, all right, I'm just like everybody else.
I didn't see. Yeah.
But like you said, like, man, if I'm able to get this, like I'm opening up a whole world of possibilities in terms of performance and keeping myself healthy over the long term.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it would be interesting. I wish I could go back in time and have some of these tests from a few years ago, because undoubtedly the positions would have been far worse because I've been chipping away through it. But it's kind of exciting to find out, okay, there's still improvement there, or room for improvement.
Absolutely. Even at this stage in the game, when you've been doing like this type of training for over a decade now, right, Scott? Yeah, and I would say probably the same for me. And the next set of testing that we would go into. So now that we have a reset for the pelvis and for the rib cage position, and again, we don't have to go necessarily into the nitty gritty of everything. I think Zac does a great job of like explaining, why your hands would be together versus apart, and why we're trying to reach overhead. So we're going to skip over that for now, and maybe as we get into things in the next few weeks, few months, we can start doing some of those aha moments for us. But the other big assessment that we did for the lower body was that hip extension test. It's an Ober's test, where basically you're lying on your side with the knees flexed to a 90-90 position. Someone lifts into abduction and then extension, and then tries to drop down. And I would say 90%, 95% of the people in the class weren't able to have true hip extension, right?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
So it doesn't shock me, especially because you're sitting around for the entire weekend. So
we're probably a little tighter than normal.
And it goes to show why sitting around is probably not great for, for pelvic positions.
Yeah. I noticed just on the second day we assessed right away in the morning, and I was significantly better than I had been the day before after
So
toward the end when we
stuck.
had sat. Well, some of it had stuck, but maybe it was partly exactly what you said. We hadn't been sitting and
Yes.
listening to lectures.
Yeah.
I mean, we got up and moved around a lot, which was nice, but that could have been a part of it too.
Yeah, and a great FYI for any of those of you who are listening to this and we're thinking about doing the Zac Cupples seminar, The Human Matrix. It's phenomenal. Some great information, but I think just the amount of like work you're doing to master some of these exercises and the hands-on stuff, and I think that's invaluable in itself, right? It's just like knowing what you're doing wrong and knowing how to correct it.
Mm-hmm. Yep, you're constantly getting up and working on this, and you're coaching a partner through it, and you get a lot of time both, trying to correct other people's positions, but also getting your positions corrected and identified and such. So
Exactly.
Yeah.
And again, I think there's no real like hard and fast ways to do things. It's more of like you have this concept and then explore the space, so to speak, right?
Mm-hmm.
So fast forwarding a little bit toward the end of things, we started thinking about like, okay, how do you apply these principles to more complex movements? And one of the biggest tools they use is isometrics, right, Scott? Mm-hmm. Can you go over that a little bit of like some ideas that kind of hit home with?
Yeah, I mean, isometrics are always a great tool for learning positions, and that's certainly what the general concept is. We're going to learn these positional breathing drills to start with, and those are very progressive. They can start from something that even your most deconditioned client can do, but they can also get really challenging, even for someone who has good capabilities.
Yeah.
And then even when you move then into training exercises, you're generally looking at either isometrics or possibly slow eccentrics. With isometrics, you're kind of mastering position. And if you have difficulty getting a position, you can make it an isometric, even if it wouldn't necessarily be an isometric, such as a simple hinge, and really learn to breathe and be in that position properly. So after spending some time there, then you can get to that position once it's a little bit more cemented, as a motor skill.
Absolutely, and I think you hit the nail on the head. Is that can you breathe in the position? And by breathe, can you actually get your ribs to come down, back, and in? Can you get the what they call a pump handle, which is your sternum and upper rib cage? Can you get that to move upward? Can you get your bucket handles, which are your lower ribs, to get in the frontal plane? And can you do that all while not having to use rectus abdominis, right?
So that's the trick, yeah. So this wants to help out, and that's not something we want, because that's generally going to pull us into a bad position.
Yeah, yeah, and to elaborate a little bit more on that, and again, why CrossFit is such a sagittal sport, why this is such a detriment to your performance, because your rectus attaches to your, is it the xiphoid process or the lower sternum there? Yeah. So basically what that's going to do is it's going to prevent that pump handle from moving, right, Scott?
Keeps you locked down and you can't get that.
Yeah, so you're not going to be able to get these ribs, upper ribs moving, which then prevents you from moving anything overhead, right?
Yeah, that's one thing we didn't touch on too much yet, but it was also a big piece, was how not being able to get 360 expansion here really prevents us from accessing our wrong arm, sorry. Internal and external rotation, and also horizontal abduction.
Can you go over a little bit of what that was about? Because we're going into the next set of testing in terms of the upper body, and this is, I love the fact that all of this assessment can be done in 5 minutes?
It's actually really quick.
It was great. I really like that, because if someone's coming in and you got to do like a 35-40 minute assessment, and again, if that's going to get you better results, but if you can get a good picture, like that 90% of what's going on just by doing about 5 minutes of assessing, that's huge. So we did what type of assessment on the upper body there, Scott?
So all done on a table. Basically, you're looking at both sides. Can you externally? This mirror image is getting me. Externally rotate, so I'd be laying prone. Mm-hmm. Internally rotate without dumping the scap, and then a horizontal abduction without the humeral head starting to pop forward, mm-hmm. which I'm doing on purpose here. That would be a negative, and you're kind of wanting to see 90 degrees internal external, and then 45 degrees here, which
was a lot, right? As relative to what we thought was probably what was passing.
Yeah, I was surprised how much that was actually.
So by determining that, what does that say about the rib cage position, Scott, or your ability to move the ribs?
It's kind of telling you where you may or may not be able to drive air, and you'll typically say people won't look the same side to side because we're typically able to get air into one side potentially better than the other.
Yeah, and without having to go into the PRI concepts, I thought Zac did a great job of just saying, like, this is what's going on. You don't really have to worry about diaphragmatic asymmetries and that kind of stuff. You just know by this, like, you don't have to know exactly the anatomical features that prevent this. You just go, this is here. This is going to be, if this is wide, you know that this a pump handle is going to be acting like this. If you know this is narrow, you know this pump handle is probably acting like this, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. And so then you can go after those. And it was amazing. I mean, my external rotation on my right side usually sucks, even, and I've obviously tried all kinds of methods. I was surprised how loose it felt after doing, kind of the proper breathing drill to assess it.
Yeah. So basically, if your internal rotation is limited on one side, you can assume that your pump handle doesn't want to come up. And if you can't, and on the opposite side of the spectrum, if you're lacking external rotation, you know that that's a scapular thoracic grooving kind of deal, and you're not getting that posterior thoracic inflated so that your shoulder blade can actually AB duct, right, Scott?
Mm-hmm.
So, basically, if your scap is pinned back, you're going to lack external rotation. And we kind of know those military postures, those athletes who can never rack a bar, right? Mm-hmm. So we're trying to drive air through that posterior thoracic to actually open it up and get that scapula moving and grooving a little bit better on that in the upper back, right, Scott?
Yeah, exactly.
Cool.
Yeah, and then the horizontal is kind of the final piece. Yeah, and another nice thing is there's a hierarchy. You infrasternal angle, clear up internal rotation, clear up external rotation, and then finally you would clear up horizontal abduction, which that can be one of a couple of things. It can be that the scapula can't adduct, come to the midline, or it can be that the tissues are kind of locked concentric, basically, in a short and contracted position on the front side of the humerus. So you can kind of parse that away, though, by looking at cleaning. If you clean up the prior stuff and you're left with that, then you kind of know where to go.
Yeah, man. So I guess that's a pretty good synopsis of all the assessment pieces. And then we went into how they progress each of the exercises. And I think they did a squat, a hinge, and then single leg, squat, hinge, and then we did upper body push-pull, and then some single leg work, right? Also, basically single leg squat, single leg hinge, right, Scott?
Yeah, it was combined both, kind of lunge variants, step-up variants, and then single leg hinge variants.
I know for me, I found that the single leg work was the most profound. Did you find that as well?
Yeah, that's... some of that stuff done that way felt very different, and I was like, oh. Yeah. And I can see, from my side to side, some stuff I've been trying to clear up and, working on, but there's I'll have to play with it more. I don't have an answer yet, but all I know is okay, if that's what that's supposed to feel like, then it clearly never does. So that could be what's been going wrong on that left side.
I know for me, my butt was on fire doing, as Scott alluded to earlier, doing 15-pound single-leg RDLs, and my butt was on fire.
It was crazy. And the amount of external oblique activation, again, I think maybe used a 26-pound kettlebell for some squatting and just lighting it up.
Yep. And one of the last things that I kind of had asked, and again, there's going to be tons of things that kind of come up, but one of the biggest things that I asked Lucy, who was working with Zac in this particular seminar, was the lack of inhibitory work that he does with his athletes and she does with her athletes. So, in the PRI world, we're doing a ton of, lat inhibition, pec inhibition, that kind of stuff, though some of the warm-up stuff has, the world's greatest stretch, that kind of thing, but they didn't really emphasize any of that within the seminar, right?
No, not at all. In fact, that was the first, when you asked the question, was the first mention, and the answer was that they just didn't find it that necessary or effective, right?
Yeah, the inhibitory work is the exercises. Mm-hmm. So if you're doing them right and you're prescribing them properly and you're explaining them properly, you really don't need inhibitory work because everything's going to kind of work itself out, right? Mm-hmm. So the other cool take-home was the idea, because for me, I have a lot of pregnant clients whether they're coming off of pregnancy or they are pregnant. And it was really cool to appreciate the idea of pressurization when you actually have a baby or after you have a baby. You want to go over a little bit of that there, Scott? So the idea that because you're now having this here, it affects the mechanics of the rib cage and the pelvis. And actually it probably is appropriate to address those prior to pregnancy and even after pregnancy, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the structural changes, it makes perfect sense when you kind of see from an anatomical perspective what's happening with the changing of the angles and the pelvis repositioning, and explains why lots of people have pains that they don't normally have as they go through pregnancy.
And even during birth, how they alluded to having 30-hour pregnancies and 30-hour labors. But one of the things to consider is the fact that you're putting women in stirrups and putting their pelvis in a position where it's actually not conducive for letting something out of the of the body.
Right. Yeah. Basically, if you look at it from a functional anatomy perspective, it's the external rotation of putting your feet in the stirrups actually pulls the pelvic outlet narrower.
And closes it. So basically, what we're trying to say is that you should be having a baby in a squat, right?
Yeah.
I mean, or think about it this way: if you're a coach, having the ability for your moms to squat all the way through, right? And not just like a CrossFit knees out squat, because I've heard many horror stories of ladies going like, well, I almost popped my hip out when I was squatting. So it's like, well, you just lost your ability to control your pelvis at some point in your pregnancy. So now you are putting yourself at risk and your pregnancy at risk by losing that. I mean, obviously, we've made it this far in the world, and there's a lot of ways of getting around that. But I think it's something to appreciate. Obviously during pregnancy, right before pregnancy, during labor, but then also afterward, in terms of restoring those pressurizations. Because I think most moms, they start getting back into the gym and they go, I got to lose weight, and they start doing 1,000 sit-ups, or they have to get their belly tight again, and now they're just rectus, and the fact that was in such an elongated position. And a concentrically loaded position for so long, it's like almost like it's popping out. You ever get that for some of your mamas?
Yeah. And then of course you have the issue of diastasis.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's almost like, don't do that. Don't do any rectus work. Let's get you breathing all the way out. Let's get some pelvic position work. Maybe strengthen up your obliques.
Obliques would be the key.
Yeah, I mean, so and again, like what an eye-opening kind of thing to talk about throughout this thing, and again, there's going to be more and more things as we look over our notes and put this stuff into practice. I think that's the biggest thing. But overall, it was an amazing weekend. Scott, you got anything else that you wanted to kind of mention?
No, yeah. If you're interested in these concepts at all, I would highly recommend it. So he gets out around the country. I think there's some on the East Coast coming out. But you could definitely check his page out. I don't know for sure. But
yeah, he's all over the Instagrams, and he's got a great YouTube page. I think the way that I found him was that the fact that when I was looking up information about PRI, like he was probably one of the only people at that time who was putting out content.
I think that might have been actually, yeah.
You know what I mean?
Very detailed reviews of the courses.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like right away. And he's in the bald crew too now. So
we are, yeah.
We were all balding it up there, and I felt really connected to somebody for the weekend. You know what I mean? Me, Scotty, and Zach had a really good time. So, guys, if you like the podcast, please like it, follow it, review it, give us 5 stars, and we'll be back next week for some more content. Scotty?
And if you have any questions, ask away.
Holy moly. Yeah, we got to get questions. That's something we haven't had yet.
We haven't
who's going to be the first asking the question? Because we got a lot of knowledge, we got a lot of perspective. Well, you have a lot of knowledge. I have a lot of opinions. So
you got a lot of knowledge.
Hopefully, we'll be able to put together something that has a semblance of coherency. But guys, I'm Sean LaFlock. You can get me at Sean at CrossFitDelrabeach.com.
I'm Scott Hagness. You get me at Scott at CrossFitPortland.com.
Scott, it was fantastic being here with you. I really love Portland. I love CrossFit Portland, and I hope to do this again face to face.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome, Scotty. We'll see you next time, guys.
Later.